An important gland in your body is the pituitary gland. It releases at least 8 hormones and is about the size of a pea. It is located within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. In this internal view of the skull, the sella turcica is visible. A depression called the hypophyseal fossa is where the pituitary gland sits. Inferior to the sella turcica is the sphenoid sinus. Let's look at the structure of the pituitary gland. It consists of 2 lobes, an anterior lobe, or the adenohypophysis, which consists of glandular tissue. Cells within this lobe produce and secrete hormones. Each cell type typically will secrete one type of hormone. The posterior pituitary, or neurohypophysis, consists of neural tissue, which is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. Separating the 2 lobes is the pars intermedia. In human beings, the pars intermedia is small. It produces and releases melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH, but in human beings, the amount is not significant, so we're not going to study it. Between the pars intermedia and the adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary, is a cleft. The hypothalamus is closely associated with the pituitary gland. It links the nervous and endocrine systems by receiving information from nerves throughout the body and using that information to maintain homeostasis. Hormones secreted by neurons within the hypothalamus are called neural hormones. Releasing and inhibiting neural hormones from the hypothalamus travel to the anterior pituitary and regulate the activity of the anterior pituitary. Recall that the posterior pituitary is actually an extension of the hypothalamus and consists of neural tissue. Neurons whose cell bodies are located within the hypothalamus produce the hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Those hormones are stored in axon terminals that are located within the posterior pituitary. When the neurons within the hypothalamus are stimulated, action potentials are generated down the axon of these neurons to the axon terminals located within the posterior pituitary, causing those neurons to release the neural hormones. We'll look at this in greater detail. In this illustration, we see the anterior pituitary on the left side. Recall that the hypothalamus secretes neural hormones that will regulate the anterior pituitary. Let's take a look. Here are the cell bodies of the neurons located within the hypothalamus. They will secrete either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. These will be tropic hormones because they will go to another gland. That gland will be the anterior pituitary. Those hormones are released into blood vessels. Recall what defines a hormone is a chemical messenger that travels through the blood. This blood vessel system is called the hypophyseal portal system and consists of a primary capillary plexus, a hypophyseal portal vein or veins, and a secondary capillary plexus. Portal veins are veins that connect 2 capillary beds. This is unusual because, recall, veins typically return blood back to the heart. In the anterior pituitary, the tropic hormones will either stimulate or inhibit the release of their target cell hormones. On the left, where the check mark is, you'll see a list of the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. These 6 hormones are the main hormones that we will study with the anterior pituitary. This is an illustration of the posterior pituitary. Recall that the posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. Instead, Neurons whose cell bodies are located within the hypothalamus produce the hormones. Recall that a group of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system is called a nucleus. There are two nuclei, the paraventricular nucleus, which produces primarily oxytocin, and the supraoptic nucleus, which produces primarily ADH. The hormones travel through the axons, which are located within the infundibulum, forming the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. They are stored in the axon terminals located in the posterior pituitary. Action potentials stimulate the release of these hormones. The hormones then enter the blood and travel to their target cells. We're going to begin with the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. There are 6 main hormones released by the anterior pituitary, and of these 6, 4 of them are tropic hormones. You will need to be able to identify the tropic hormones. Recall that a tropic hormone is a hormone that has as its target another endocrine gland. Let's look at the characteristics of all anterior pituitary hormones. They will either be peptides or proteins, so these are amino acid-based hormones. They will be regulated by neurohormones released from the hypothalamus, so they are regulated by hormonal stimuli, primarily by negative feedback mechanisms. Here is a list of the 6 hormones released by the anterior pituitary. I'm going to list them now, but we're going to talk about each one in particular. GH, which is growth hormone. Prolactin, hopefully you can see the term lactin is related to lactation or milk production. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And LH, luteinizing hormone. Let's begin with growth hormone or somatotropin. Be sure to know both names for this hormone. Growth hormone is an anabolic hormone, meaning that it brings about synthesis. It has both direct and indirect actions. Direct actions occur when growth hormone binds to its target cell and stimulates a series of events within the cell to produce the product. It is considered a general metabolic hormone. Recall that your metabolism is the sum of all your chemical reactions. So it will influence protein, carbohydrate, and lipid metabolism. Through the process of lipolysis, triglycerides will be broken down in response to growth hormone. Recall that triglycerides are broken down into 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. The fatty acids can be used as a source of energy. This allows you to spare glucose within the blood and use the fatty acids for the production of ATP. It also increases blood glucose levels in other ways. By decreasing glucose uptake by cells, breaking down glycogen stores in the liver through glycogenolysis. Recall that glycogen is how you store your glucose. When you break down the glycogen, you break it back down into glucose. Also, by stimulating gluconeogenesis, the synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrates, such as the glycerol of the triglycerides and amino acids from proteins. Because growth hormone elevates or increases your blood glucose levels, it is an anti-insulin hormone. Remember that insulin decreases your blood glucose levels, so growth hormone does the opposite. To recap what we've just talked about, growth hormone then will decrease your fat stores or your triglyceride stores and conserve carbohydrates, your glucose. In addition, it's going to increase the amount of transport proteins on the membrane for amino acids. This will increase the number of amino acids within the cell, making them available for protein synthesis. Indirect actions involve using another chemical. Growth hormone stimulates the release of insulin-like growth factors from the liver, muscle cells, bone cells, and other tissues as well. Insulin-like growth factor then is what brings about the end result, the growth of the skeletal muscles and long bones. So how does this occur? Insulin-like growth factor, or IGFs, stimulate cell growth so they become larger, and this occurs through protein synthesis. Cell division, so you increase the number of cells that you have. It targets osteoblasts, remember these are bone cells, so that they begin to divide to give rise to more bone, as well as chondrocytes. Recall that these are cartilage cells. The release of growth hormone is regulated by neurohormones from the hypothalamus. These are growth hormone inhibiting hormone and growth hormone releasing hormone. The secretion of these hormones are regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. An inhibiting hormone prevents the anterior pituitary from releasing growth hormone, and a releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. As you can see from this figure or graph, the concentration of growth hormone in your plasma decreases with age. There are several factors that stimulate the release of GHRH from the hypothalamus, which in turn will stimulate the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. The first factor is hypoglycemia, or low blood glucose levels. A second factor is low fatty acid levels in the blood. A third factor is high levels of amino acids in your blood. When trying to determine what the stimulus for the release of a hormone is, consider what that hormone does. Growth hormone increases carbohydrate levels as well as fatty acid levels in the blood, and increases the uptake of amino acids into the cell. Since these are the actions of growth hormone, the opposite conditions will be the stimuli for the release of the hormone. Additional stimuli include exercise, excitement, trauma, and the hormone ghrelin. The release of growth hormone is diurnal. About an hour after you go to sleep, the levels of growth hormone in your plasma increase about 5 times. Let's look at some imbalances of growth hormone. Hyposecretion of growth hormone during childhood influences the growth of the long bones. Individuals with hyposecretion during childhood will attain a maximum height of around 4 feet, but usually will have normal body proportions. Hypersecretion of growth hormone, while the epiphyseal plates are still present, will result in a condition called gigantism. Individuals can reach a height of 8 feet. If the hypersecretion occurs after the growth plates or epiphyseal plates have closed, acromegaly results. In acromegaly, the growth occurs at the extremities. Bones and connective tissue within the face, the hands, and the feet enlarge. Both of these conditions can lead to enlarged organs, such as the heart, as well as hyperglycemia, and possibly diabetes. Both conditions are usually due to tumors, either on the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland. Gigantism is illustrated in this young woman in the top left. Pituitary dwarfism on the right side, and down at the bottom in the left you can see the acromegaly. and the increase in the feet, as well as the bones in the face. The second hormone released by the anterior pituitary is prolactin. The term itself means for lactation. Prolactin is secreted generally in women who have given birth. It stimulates growth of the mammary glands and initiates milk production after childbirth, as well as maintaining milk production for the duration of breastfeeding. The main stimulus for prolactin release is suckling of the nipple by an infant. The function in males is unknown. The regulation of prolactin is by an inhibiting hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone. When the hormone is present, prolactin is not secreted. When the hormone is absent or decreased, prolactin is secreted. The third hormone released by the anterior pituitary is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. As the name implies, ACTH is a tropic hormone whose target is the adrenal cortex. It goes primarily to the zonas fasciculata and reticularis. In response to ACTH, the zona fasciculata increases its release of cortisol. In addition, ACTH stimulates melanocytes, cells that release melanin, a pigment. The release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary is controlled by the neural hormone from the hypothalamus called corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. The levels of CRH are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. A fourth hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. This is another tropic hormone. Its target is the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. It influences the growth and activity of the thyroid gland. And it is regulated by another releasing hormone called thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The last two hormones are gonadotropic hormones. They are tropic hormones whose target are the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes. Follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, goes to the gonads, and in the female stimulates follicle development in the ovaries. Follicles are structures that we will talk about when we get into the reproductive system, but it is within the follicles that the cells which become eggs develop. So a simple way of thinking about this is FSH is involved in egg development. In addition, in males, FSH stimulates sperm development in the testes. The second gonadotropic hormone is luteinizing hormone, or LH. In the female, luteinizing hormone stimulates or triggers ovulation, the release of the oocyte that will become an egg if it is fertilized. LH stimulates testosterone production in the male. For now, this is all you'll need to know about these two hormones. We'll cover them in the reproductive system. The gonadotropic hormones are regulated by gonadotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Use these review questions when studying the anterior pituitary. Now let's look at the hormones of the posterior pituitary. Recall that these hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus and stored and released by the posterior pituitary. There are two, oxytocin and ADH. We're going to begin with oxytocin. Oxytocin is controlled by a positive feedback mechanism. It has two main targets: the smooth muscles of the uterine wall and the mammary glands of the breast. Let's start with the uterine wall. The action of oxytocin is to increase uterine contractions during labor. As the baby begins to drop, it pushes up against the inferior portion of the uterus called the cervix. Stretch receptors in the cervix send information to the hypothalamus. In response, the posterior pituitary releases oxytocin. It travels by way of the blood to the smooth muscles in the uterine wall. When it binds to the receptors, it stimulates an increase in calcium within the cell. So intracellular calcium levels increase. This increases muscle contractions. This positive feedback mechanism will continue until the stimulus is gone. In other words, until the baby is born. A synthetic form of oxytocin is called Pitocin. It can be used to progress labor. A second action of oxytocin is to cause milk ejection or letdown. This is in response to suckling by the baby. Mechanoreceptors in the breast send information to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus again releases oxytocin. Traveling by the blood, the oxytocin then binds to the receptors within the mammary glands. The glands called alveoli then will release the milk into the ducts. The target for the oxytocin are myoepithelial cells. Remember that the term myo means muscle. These epithelial cells have proteins that bring about contraction. They squeeze up against the alveoli, squeezing the milk into the ducts. This leads to milk letdown. The second hormone released by the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Diuresis is urine formation. An antidiuretic is a substance that inhibits or decreases urine formation. The stimulus for the release of ADH is an increase in the osmolality, or solute concentration, of the blood plasma. Osmoreceptors located within the hypothalamus are stimulated when the osmolality increases by only 1 to 2%. They in turn will communicate with neurons in the hypothalamus. The neurons then will initiate an action potential that will cause the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary. One of the main targets of ADH is the kidneys. At the kidneys, ADH will increase the reabsorption of water. Water will move out of the urine, concentrating the urine, and return back to the plasma, increasing the plasma volume. This in turn will return the osmolality back to normal. When ADH is released in large amounts, it will cause vasoconstriction. A second target, therefore, of ADH are the smooth muscles in your blood vessels. ADH will cause these smooth muscles to contract, decreasing the diameter of the blood vessels. This is vasoconstriction. When this occurs, blood pressure increases. For this reason, ADH is also known as vasopressin. There is a direct relationship between plasma volume and blood pressure. When plasma volume drops, blood pressure drops as well. So in the end, ADH will increase the amount of water that is in your plasma, increasing plasma volume, which will increase blood pressure. Therefore, the stimulus, again, is an increase in osmolality, which is reflected by a decrease in water in the plasma, or a decrease in blood pressure. You will only be responsible for one imbalance for ADH. There is a type of imbalance that is due to hyposecretion of ADH. The syndrome diabetes insipidus is usually the result of a tumor on the pituitary gland or a blow to the hypothalamus or pituitary. Diabetes means overflow, an overflow of urine. Insipidus means tasteless. This is to distinguish it from diabetes mellitus. Mel refers to honey. In diabetes mellitus, there is an overflow of urine, increased urine output, but glucose is present in the urine, hence the honey. Clinicians used to have to be able to taste the urine to determine whether an individual had diabetes mellitus or not. Symptoms of diabetes insipidus include thirst, intense thirst, as well as huge amounts of urine production. If an individual is conscious, the thirst center in the hypothalamus will stimulate them to increase water intake. This will return plasma volumes back to normal. However, if the patient is unconscious, a saline intravenous solution will have to be administered to maintain plasma volumes. Alcohol also inhibits the release of ADH. Individuals that are drinking alcohol then will urinate often, so urine output increases, and this can lead to a drop in plasma volume, thus a drop in blood pressure. This concludes this module.